churches quickly. Roman Catholic Church, of course, very dominant because of the early French occupation. And even in the villages, there's a procession up in Portsmouth, and the bishop visiting the villages. You know, the bishop was as powerful as the governor, and basically controlled things in a big way. And the Roman Catholic Church, therefore, became in 1850, had a diocese of its own, the Diocese of Roseau. And then is when we see church building stepping up, because before they were in little thatched huts, they were in wooden huts. And particularly in the 1870s, there was a big movement for constructing churches all around Dominica. The earliest, however, the earliest religious image that we have is the Bellecour of Grand Bay from the time of the Jesuits, who occupied, they had the big first plantation there. It's a whole scandal, but the Jesuits were the first large slave owners in Dominica, and they ran the estate which now we call Geneva, but in those old days was called Les Jésuites. So there is the Bellecour, and it stood the test of time, carved entirely out of solid rock, because what was happening is Gerard Rolle, very religious, was putting up these wooden crosses. He describes it himself. And every time he put up a wooden cross, the Calenagros would come and burn it down, break it down, shoot arrows into it, and all that kind of stuff. And so he decided, you know, in a good Creole way, "Moke bonpou, I will be good for you." And he got his slaves to carve this out of stone and drag it and put it up. Not here, it was down in the estate, but then the Lockharts fell out with the Roman Catholic Church and told them they must move their church and move their crosses. And so they had to drag everything up onto the hill. That's another story. And the interior, sadly, you know, we know what's going on at present. Sadly, the interior of that beautiful Father Charles, bless his soul, took out all the ornate chandelier candelabra and all that, took all the brass candlesticks, huge candlesticks from the altar. And I must confess, I have a couple of them in my living room. But it was his fault, he just threw them out. So, sadly. But that was how it was at the time, back two revolution has to take place within the church. And so the church went through various phases. You had your first thatched wooden church that we would have seen if we blew up that picture of the attack on Roseau in 1761. And this was built by a priest called Father Martel. Then we get a bigger church of stone being constructed. Now, the important thing with Father Martel's church is you left the church and you walked straight down Church Street to the bay, Notre Dame de Bon Port, Our Lady of Fair Haven. Or you left the bay and you walked straight up to the front door. But as the church needed to be bigger, they shifted it north-south instead. So up to now, we go through the side door if we're going through that gate. I must add that because George III wanted to keep the French happy, all the French citizens in Dominica, they were paying tax, they were contributing to the emergent colony, so he didn't want to upset the Roman Catholic French, and he gave them 10 acres of land, leased 10 acres of land in the middle, on the edge of Roseau. What was then on the edge of Roseau. And that is why all St. Mary's Academy, St. Ives, all of the bishop's house and all that fits within that 10 acres of land. And then when 1865 came and the 99-year lease was up, the bishop asked that it be handed over in freehold, and that was what was done. So that is how the Roman Catholics got it. And then the next stage now was the adding, extending, and adding. And then eventually, in the 1850s, you had the tower, and then the steeple came later, and the last thing to be added was the side tower in 1916, because they were demolishing the church in the graveyard at Point Bishop and building a new church on the hill. So they took the tower from the old Point Bishop church and they put it there. So that's the end. That was the final spot for that church. It struggles still. Anglican Church is struggling. Everybody's trying to piece together their various churches. And here is Lapley. Lapley, very beautiful church. And just like the Casabus Church, Lapley Church and Casabus Church are actually built of stone that came from the plantation works of the neighboring estate. The plantation owners of Wanneroo told the church, you can strip down, break down the plantation, and take the stones and build a church. Which is what they did, and that's why when you go to Citrus Creek, you don't see any tall thing, everything is flat. You can see where the buildings used to be. But there is no walls because it's been taken for the church. But it's a very quaint, beautiful church. It has its knocks about in terms of hurricanes and storms, but it basically survives very well indeed. And this is a more recent church on the wooden churches that were there before at Collywood Church. Wonderful story about the earlier church of wood, where the priest, and this would never, cannot happen today, where the priest says we're going to build a new wooden church, and it's going to be done by Koudme. Everybody's going to contribute. So everybody will go over the next few months and they will cut wood in the forest. Everybody went all up in Jablotin, everywhere cutting wood, preparing wood. And then on one Sunday, before the Sunday came up, of course, he said, and on this Sunday, we drag all the wood, drag down the things to Biosh, we drag down the valley to Jubla, we put it on boats, and we bring it. And the whole village, except for elderly and little infants, left the village of Collywood and brought it and built a wooden church. This replaces that wooden church that was there. It's had a couple of fires, but it maintains itself. And then, of course, we have Soufriere, beautiful 1778, right there on the sea, because a lot of the parishioners were coming by boat from Scott's Head and around the coast. And so you landed on the beach and you went straight at the church. The interesting thing about this church building is the cave that is next to it in the mountain is where the workmen found this amazing pre-Columbian image, the religious object, Zini, and they brought it to the priest, and the priest sent it to France, and now it is in the Musée Belle, the Museum for Ethnography in Paris. So that's where it is. Anglican Church. Now the Anglicans really did not get off fast enough to build a church. There was a church on the Newtown Savannah, but you know, these people are scattered all over the island. They were not extremely religious, and the church fell apart. And they put together a committee eventually in 1800. They put together a committee. Mr. James Garraway, he was on the church committee, and eventually in 1818, 1820, they actually were able to build this church. They built it as a cube. And then when the British population and the Montserratian and the Antigua population, all Protestants, were increasingly coming to Dominica at the end of the 19th century, early 20th, they said, oh, we must build a bigger church. I'm afraid that was their mistake. Because what they did is they extended the church to the south. It had all these little separate rooms, like the Ticais. 1, 2, 3. Tiny rooms all held together. But in building a bigger church, a longer church, they would put one big long roof. And that's what happened in Hurricane David. Took the walls with it. David, I didn't even bother to put a picture of Maria because you see for yourself what it was. That's inside. So now, many people here, I think the White Juliard people, as well as the church council, trying to resolve, putting out feelers to see where we can get funds. Methodist Church, that has an interesting story to itself. All I will say about the Methodist Church is, I told you about those 10 acres that the king gave to the Roman Catholics. Well, the Roman Catholics then leased out some of the lots to loyal members. But by the early 19th century, 2 of them became Methodists. And they allowed the Methodists to build their chapel and their manse on the lots. So when the time came for the Roman Catholic Church to ask the governor to end the lease and give them the land, they said, oh, that land the Methodists have, that was the original lease from the king back in 1764. So we want it back. The governor of the day said, no, 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 fair is fair. That's for the Methodists. You are next door, you have all that land, keep it. But there was a lot of ding-dong, fighting in the streets between the Methodists and the Catholics over their juxtaposition so close to one another. That's another story. I did mention Soufriere, and then we have St. Anne's and Paul at Massac. Now this is interesting from a point of view of construction. What happens in the early 20th century, from about 1900 on, is there's this new style of continuous casting of concrete. Like you make a form and you cast the concrete in place. And as you move the form up, you cast it. There are no bricks. It's entirely cast concrete with chippings. And the Anglican Church, the Massac Church is one of those. The tower did not come with the church. The first church was concrete, but then a tower was added later on. But it is the same type of building as the ones that we have cast concrete, the library, the Victoria Building, Charlotte Valley House. This was the time when they were doing this pattern of fully cast concrete.